It's no secret that games change a lot between conception and release. There's a saying in the film industry, a movie is made 3 times. It's made when it's written, it's made in production, and it's made again in post. And the same definitely applies for games. As a matter of fact, I think it might even be more than that, because interactive entertainment has so many more moving pieces than your average movie. You have multiple levels of programming, modeling, rigging, script writing, voiceover, QA testing, and so on. It's unimaginable to have a game be entirely unchanged from the original concept by the time the game is finished. And so that's why you have so many different games that have unused concepts, or cut content that never made it into the finished product. There's entire websites dedicated to the cutting room floor of video games, and one particularly interesting piece of content left on the cutting room floor belongs to the ever-anomalous Twisted Metal Black. I'm always interested in finding out new facts and tidbits about this game. One of those tidbits is how the game's story changed from the beta to the final release. A user by the name of Dark Scorpius managed to get his hands on the beta cutscenes for Twisted Metal Black. I don't know how he managed to get his hands on them, but however he did, I salute you, Dark Scorpius. If you want to watch these cutscenes yourself without me talking over them, I'll put a link in the description. Otherwise, for the benefit of the tape, let's take a look at how Twisted Metal Black changed. There are a few universal things I have to make note of first of all. Because these are beta cutscenes, there's obviously going to be a lot of elements that are stand-ins for what would eventually end up being in the final cut. You have different voice actors in some cases who obviously weren't professionals and were just there so their rigging team had something to work with. You also have general rigging instructions left in that would end up in the final cut. You even have some models standing in for other models, which is always funny. This is the last time I'll acknowledge these quirks unless it's particularly relevant because they are a universal thing. Elsewise, I will only be discussing the individual cutscenes and how they differ from their respective final versions. I probably won't catch every single difference, so if you notice I missed something, let me know in the comments. And while I'm shilling, donate to my Patreon, fools. So let's start with... We start with the best one, because as you'll know, I believe that Sweet Tooth's ending in Twisted Metal Black is the best ending in the history of Twisted Metal. The acting, the visuals, the script, the execution, both figuratively and literally, it is pitch perfect. Which is why it's a good thing that they left this ending alone. The only thing they changed is some of the visuals, but that's a fairly inconsequential change, and I'm assuming they left it unchanged because Sweet Tooth is the star of the game, so they were probably working on his story as early as possible. So they knew exactly what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it very early on into development. Sweet Tooth, after years of rampaging, was captured by the authorities and put on death row, but at the last minute, Preacher put a curse on him that left his head on fire forever. So now he's entering the contest to hopefully undo the curse, as the pain only gets worse with every passing moment. But he refuses the cure because it would mean he would never be able to kill again. There's nothing I can add. They knew what they wanted this story to be, and they went with it from moment one, and I respect that. Junkyard Dog, aka Billy Ray Stillwell, is a case where most of the content remains the same. He's horribly mutated by a crop duster spraying him with all sorts of lovely chemicals, and then he goes on to find out that this was a conspiracy by his wife and her boy toy whom she was cheating on Billy with. He then murdered his wife and goes on a revenge quest to find the man who ruined his life and bring him justice with the business end of whatever sharp object is within reach. The largest relevant change for Billy Ray's ending is that the song that plays while he's committing horrible atrocities to the pilot isn't Going Under by Daryl Wayne Perry, but instead a song called Your Cheating Heart by Hank Williams. That couldn't be more on the nose if they tried.
You can't just have your characters announce how they feel. That makes me feel angry.
Glad they changed that. Otherwise, the entire scene is unchanged, and I'm fine with that. Brimstone, aka Preacher, is yet another one that's basically unchanged, save for a few key moments. Basically, Preacher is infused with the soul of an ancient demon that up to that point was encompassing a lowly child. The demon inside him then forced Preacher to lay waste to everything around him until the demon left him at the worst possible moment and he was subsequently arrested thereafter. But it turns out there was no demon at all, and Preacher was just a complete madman who went off the deep end during a baptism, somehow equating it to an exorcism. Fun stuff. The only change that I noticed, and it's a minor, although significant change, is that they're a little bit more explicit with the showcasing of his, shall we say, raving lunacy when we get a lot more detail in the baptism/exorcism scene. Boy, that would definitely not fly even in an M-rated game. Even for a game as dark as this one, you still need to abide by some sort of restraint. And they still got the same point across without having to be so explicit, or more to the point, edgelord, so it's not that big of a deal. Ah yes, Crazy 8. No Face. Frank the Tank. The man whose face is not for the faint of heart. Okay, so once again, another case where I'm glad they chose not to alter the subject matter of these scenes too much. Frank the Tank is an unsuspecting boxer who gets his face rearranged during a fight, and so he has to get facial reconstruction surgery. But as a result of the doctor betting on him and losing a bunch of money, he decides to further rearrange Frank's face out of sheer pettiness, compelling the now named No Face to go on a journey of revenge against the doctor. The only major change I could notice is that they were a lot more explicit in showing the surgery, particularly the stitching up of Frank's face. So if you're squeamish, No Face is already a disturbing character, but this entire cutscene will probably turn your stomach. Obviously the official ending has some more additions, such as not having a stock photo of a boxer in the cutscene. Yes, I know it's from Raging Bull, I'm being snide. And also adding some detail to Frank's rampage through the hospital. Medical horror is one of the few things that really gets to me, so that's why I'm fine that they changed this scene to be a little bit more implied. Now let's move on as fast as our feet can take us before YouTube demonetizes me again. Oh great, if I wasn't being demonetized before. Bloody Mary, the driver of Spectre, is probably the least changed out of every single one of these characters, with the exception of Sweet Tooth. Her story, her ending, everything is pretty much identical, minus a few differences in shots here and there. Most notably, many of her flashbacks take place in the reflection of her eye, which I actually think is a better artistic choice looking at it, as it sells the idea of reflecting on your life better than just a standard flashback. As a matter of fact, there seems to be a different visual aesthetic to the entire cutscene here that I quite like. Lots of stark blues. I'm kind of disappointed that they changed it because it's just more visually striking. Also, after she, you know, does her friend Kristen in, she's only implied to have dragged her body into one of the change rooms in this ending, but they actually specify that she did so in the official release.
I dragged Kristen's fat, ugly body into one of the dressing rooms and bolted the door. Then no one was.
Other than that, nothing really stuck out to me as being very different. At least nothing of supreme relevance. Okay, I'm not gonna lie. Yellow Jacket, or just Taxi's ending in this video, is absolutely hilarious.
I was a real smart kid. It just came easy to me. I was able to put together this controller. It made my dad alive again.
That voice acting seriously reminds me of something terribly offensive. That's what the video is called.
And I say, don't you ever say that! You could hurt someone's feelings!
I'm half expecting him to go into detail over all the ways he's gonna bop the people that killed his dad. It sounds like they just got one of the developers to voice the kid. I don't know, whoever they got to voice this sounds like he was just riffing over a couple of still images. There's even one moment where he cracks up.
No! It was a trick! He destroyed my controller, it killed my dad!
Sorry, there's more to this than just hilariously bad voice acting. Obviously, the only change is a large chunk of the dialogue. Probably because the script had yet to be finalized. It gets the same points across, but with different, more hilariously badly delivered words. The unnamed Kane child's father, Charlie, is murdered, and so the child reanimated him and entered the contest in hopes of getting his dad back for real. But Calypso refuses, instead offering the child the chance to be Calypso's protege to take over the contest once Calypso's gone. Good ending, hilariously bad voice acting. The subject matter of Warthog's lone cutscene is pretty well identical, minus one change that makes this one ride the line between mostly unchanged and somewhat unchanged. He still wants to remove the part of his brain that makes it hard for him to kill people, been there done that, and gets exactly that. They even keep the mention of Sweet Tooth as a potential rival.
They thought that clown freak was something. They ain't seen nothing yet.
Obviously, the in-game art they use to portray these cutscenes is quite different. As a matter of fact, I think I made it a point to mention previously that I thought they just included concept art in place of art for the actual cutscenes. But in this case, there's no doubt in my mind that these pictures are actually just that, concept art. The lone major change outside of the voice acting being laughable is the fact that, much like another character we'll get into in a minute, the names have been changed. The driver of Warthog in the official release was named Cage, whereas in these early beta builds, they named him Marv. Which is hilarious to me, because now all I'm doing is picturing this guy's lines delivered in the same cadence as Marv from Home Alone. I really do wonder how down to the wire they were getting for these other characters, considering the main vehicles have almost completed cutscenes, but the cutscenes for the secret characters are barely started comparatively. Questions. So, this is an interesting one. It's 1971, and the man who would become Mr. Grimm is fighting in Vietnam. His friend Benny is mortally wounded, and they're both captured and thrown into a pit. And in no uncertain terms, Mr. Grimm is forced to eat Benny, his own friend, in order to survive. Isn't that just fun for the whole family? Everything here is mostly the same. Even most of the shots are still identical, minus some polish. But there is one conspicuous change. I seemed to remember that they specified the ethnicity of the Viet Cong advisor as American, but apparently I misremembered or possibly had a series of small strokes. They never actually specified the ethnicity of the advisor in the finished version. However, in the beta version, they specify that he's Russian.
The guy was a Russian advisor to the Viet Cong.
This would make sense. The flashback is set in 1971, so it would be at the height of the Cold War, meaning that a Russian advisor to the Vietnamese wouldn't be out of the question. Mr. Grimm even says in the end that he's never had Russian.
It's funny. I'd never had Russian before.
But I guess it might have been seen as a little bit insensitive in the year 2001 to show the Russians as in any way evil, so they decided to cut it. No big deal, now he's just some man of unspecified ethnicity with a gold tooth. That's fine. A little bit disappointing, but it's still not a big deal. The story and ending is otherwise still great, so it's not something I'm gonna get too hung up on. So Shadow, aka Raven, is yet another character whose entire story is basically unchanged, minus some details. She wants to get revenge on a couple of boys from her school who drowned her best friend Kelly. First of all, in the video given, much like Cage originally being named Marv, she's actually not named Raven, but rather Sad Sally. I'm glad they changed it, because Sad Sally sounds so stupid. Seriously. Otherwise than that, there are some additional lines given, such as it being established that these bullies have been making their lives a living hell since they were in 5th grade.
They'd been making our lives hell since 5th grade. They were some jerk-off guys from school.
And also the reason they wanted to drown Kelly was because they learned in history class that in the olden days they would test to see if someone was a witch by seeing if they float in water. I don't know why these lines were left out. It feels like it builds a little bit more of a world for these characters. I feel like dealing with a long-term bully is a lot more compelling than just two random guys pulling up who may or may not have any personal beef with the characters in question. So yeah, not quite the best in that regard, but otherwise it's an unchanged ending, and it's a solid ending to begin with, so it makes sense that they would keep it unchanged. So Roadkill is an undercover FBI agent who was sent in to infiltrate an apocalypse cult and foiled their plans to unleash whatever deadly viruses were contained at the Center for Disease Control in Midtown. But an explosion rocked him and left him with no memories. His main story remains pretty consistent, although there are several details completely changed. First of all, John Doe isn't the name he's going by, but rather he's simply called Ed in this ending, which probably was just a placeholder name because John Doe makes more sense thematically. Second, in this shot, they gave him a one race, one country tattoo, which is removed in the final version, which is funny because it's kind of half-assed as they still show it in some of the shots in the official release. So it just comes and goes as they please. Third, they go into a lot greater detail into the plan they had to bring about the apocalypse, including a tidbit about the plan coming to their leader in his dreams.
And then one night, our leader, he heard this voice in his dreams. It told him it was our job to bring about the end of the world.
They even had a bit in the middle cutscene that shows John Doe going back after their plan had been initiated, but ultimately being unsure why, the details of which weren't properly revealed until the final cutscene in the official release. Which I think is a good thing because it leaves more ambiguity, so when the final reveal happens and we learned that John Doe was actually a good person who was deep undercover, it comes as much more of a cathartic payoff. It's also worth noting that the picture of his family is different, although that might have just been been because they didn't quite have the pictures ready at that point. To me, the most interesting change is the tattoo though, because despite still being an apocalypse cult in the original version, this tattoo implies that there was a much different plan for what kind of gang John Doe was running with. And we'll get back to that in Outlaw's ending. Boy howdy will we. Okay, so I was kind of debating whether or not I would put Axel in the category of somewhat changed or entirely changed, because it kind of rides that line. But considering that the change that they do make completely alters the context of the story, I'd say it's pretty well entirely different. It's the same idea. Axel is a man looking for the person who killed his close family member, so enters the Twisted Metal contest in hopes of finding that person. Unfortunately, in this case, that family member is not his wife, but rather, his son.
I wanted to know who killed my son, and I wanted revenge.
Yikes. I honestly couldn't tell you which one I would consider more heartbreaking. I personally consider losing both a wife and a son roughly equally tragic, but it's also sad they had to change it, because personally I think in this context it makes more sense that it was his son, because Sweet Tooth drives around in an ice cream truck, which is something they make a point to mention, so clearly it's an important part of the story. And it makes more sense that a child would be out and about while an ice cream truck is around. But also, there's a reason why most developers don't have children in their games, because in the eyes of the public, bad things happening are rightfully amplified when they're happening to children, because they're innocent and powerless against the more harsh sides of reality. Which is also why things like Grand Theft Auto have never included children as NPCs. The implications are far too disturbing. It would easily get the game banned. The shifting of the subject matter being about a wife to a child also means the dialogue is fairly affected, but I'd say that all falls under the same umbrella. Apparently he didn't go down easy though. So yeah, I think it would make more sense story-wise the way this version does it, but it makes sense that they would change it. Even though I would consider either losing your significant other or your child equally tragic, removing any mention of children was probably the right way to go. Moving on. Now, much of the subject matter here is roughly the same as far as Dollface having a mask forced on her and wanting to remove the mask, but there are a few significant changes that basically completely recontextualizes this entire story. First of all being that the person previously named Mr. Creel is not Dollface's boss at her first job out of university. Mr. Creel, who's not actually named Mr. Creel to my knowledge, is actually, get this, her dad.
I dreamed about my dad. Working on those creepy masks he used to make.
And instead of the masks being a job, it's actually her dad's hobby in this interpretation. Plus, his wife and Dollface's mother died the previous year.
Mom died the year before. I missed her a whole lot.
Anyway, her mother allegedly died by falling down the stairs. Dollface is specifically told never to talk about her, so you get the sense that there's more to this story than simply her falling down the stairs by accident, and instead of having the mask be put on Dollface because of spilling coffee all over important documents, her father is actually triggered by loud noises, and so when she drops a bottle, he gets violently angry and clamps this specially made mask on her. It's also worth noting that in this version of events, Dollface is actually much younger. I would hazard to guess she's 12 years old at most when this happens, when she was fresh out of university in the final release. So yeah, a few changes, but all extremely important changes. But once you get past that, the rest of this is pretty much the same. Most notably the ending where she chooses to take the key which activates a Rube Goldberg machine that kills her dad, but decided not to remove the mask. And that, as they say, is that. The absolute zenith of these different takes on the characters comes with Outlaw, aka Agent Stone. First of all, his handle isn't actually Outlaw, but rather SWAT. I think they probably made that change out of a desire to have the police character be connected thematically to the police characters from the previous games, but that's the only change that doesn't veer into uncomfortable territory. This is gonna get really dark, really fast, even for the standards of this game. In the final release, these bald shirtless dudes that Agent Stone shot at were nothing more than a doomsday cult wanting to kill a whole bunch of people for no grand reason, and Outlaw felt righteously indignant over all the people they killed and subsequently his losing battle against crime. So him going overboard was out of a sense of passion, but there's a deeper meaning behind the cult's appearance. Every single member is an identical looking bald dude. It's implied that it's the same gang that John Doe was running with, the one with a strange multi-pronged tattoo that either looks like some sort of weird sci-fi key lock or the logo to a futuristic pharmaceutical company. especially because the statement on the tattoo fits thematically, although in Outlaw's ending, no such tattoo exists, but that doesn't change the subject matter of what the bald shirtless dudes are doing in this ending. Originally, they were not an apocalypse cult, they were actually skinheads, making their pursuit of death and destruction a lot more uncomfortable. It definitely cuts a little bit too uncomfortably close to the bone, and if that's not enough, you get to see Agent Stone's backstory. When he was a kid, his house was burnt down and his family was killed by a very similar clan of people. That is dark as hell. But it also explains very thoroughly exactly why Agent Stone loses control in this moment, consumed by his anger and his traumatic experiences with these types of people. And in that moment, he accidentally does the unthinkable. The rest of his backstory is relatively unchanged, but this little additional element changes and recontextualizes everything, and I'm not sure if I liked that they changed it, or would have preferred it stay the same. Because on one hand it makes more sense from a personality standpoint that you would lose control in this instance if it were the original interpretation. Trauma is more powerful than passion, and all that. But at the same time, even for a game this dark, this is potentially too disturbing. Do we really need subject matter this uncomfortable in our games? I don't know, that's not up to me to decide. All I know is Twisted Metal is something I play for escapism, and even at its most disturbing, these games are still relatively tame by my standards, but this definitely made me uncomfortable. Okay, so Manslaughter, aka Black's story, is largely unchanged. There is, however, one key difference, and it's such a baffling inclusion that I have to wonder what the hell they were thinking. They gave Black a narration from a guy with an actual normal voice.
There was hope. I knew I had made him strong enough. Black was alive, and as long as we still had Black, we still had a chance to bring down Calypso.
I think the idea here is that they wanted to make it seem like Black wasn't really the main character of his own story and there was a larger force behind him. One that had created him, one that put him up to entering the contest, and one that was putting him up to assassinate Calypso. It's a decent idea and does give some ambiguity to the story of Black, knowing that there's an entirely different person pulling the strings behind the scenes that we never see. But it also makes it somewhat less interesting because when you're narrating over Black's cutscenes, it destroys that monstrous ambiguity that made Black such a compelling character. Especially when the narrator is only just giving a play-by-play of what's happening. If you're gonna give a play-by-play of what's happening moment to moment, you might as well just have the separate character there with Black. There's also another interesting inclusion, when the character narrating the cutscene implies what his motivation here was.
All of my dreams dashed, ruined. My family's death still unavenged.
Honestly, I think that also eliminates a lot of the compelling ambiguity from Black, because having this force of nature that you don't know the purpose behind is a lot more compelling than knowing he was just put up to it because somebody wanted to avenge their family. Plus, this also adds a lot of unhealthy questions, such as why this person who wants to avenge their family decided to create some sort of genetically engineered super mutant, and how they got the resources or means to do that. Adding the human element to this makes it require more of an explanation, in my opinion. Plus, there's the implication that they're gonna enter next year's contest and try again. You'd think at that point Calypso would know exactly what you're trying to do, so you might as well just find another way to do it. Yeah, if I'm being honest, this entire interpretation of the character of Black is so asinine, and all because they decided to add an ill-advised narrator. I think the most interesting part of this is that it shows you the progression of ideas in the game's development. What things stuck, and what ideas were thrown out alongside last week's garbage. And also it shows you just how far along some of these cutscenes were. While some of the main characters' stories were changed, the cutscenes were relatively finished. Those beta cutscenes, however, for the bonus characters were not far along at all during development. Some were barely started, so it makes you wonder if they intended to have all characters to have a full roster of cutscenes, but then some characters had to be prioritized over others due to time constraints, because even in the final release outside of Yellow Jacket, the bonus characters' cutscenes are fairly minimal. And then there's Minion, who doesn't have cutscenes at all. Definitely the majority of these changes were for the best, but there are some things that I either wish didn't need to be changed or weren't changed. And I also kinda wish that this would have been included in the game officially somehow, like maybe as a bonus movie that you can unlock by doing some crazy thing. It's weird that it found its way to YouTube basically because some random person happened to have connections. But once again, I'd like to thank Dark Scorpius for rescuing these cutscenes. You can view them all in full in the description. And I'd also like to thank you all for watching. If you like what I do and want to support the channel financially, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards, including early access, exclusive content, and Discord benefits like these fine folks here. And an extra special thank you to users GAW004 and FarmCat84 for going above and beyond. And you can also support the channel for free by liking this video, leaving a comment telling me what you think, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!